Yes, and. Damanhur is a living lab for the future. People come here from all over the world and exchange their research and ideas. Yes, and is a way to share their inspiring stories so that we can build a more awakened world together.
Good morning, Ross. Welcome to Yes and. It's such a pleasure and an honor to have you here. You're one of the great visionaries of our times. You're a visionary in the field of social living, economics, sustainability, and really the future. You co-founded GEN, the Global Ecovillages Network. Could you tell us a little bit about what has happened since then, and what is your vision for the future?
Maybe we'd be good to start and tell you about how it came about that we formed this Ecovillage movement in '91, and it really goes back to about 20 years earlier, 1970 or so, in Denmark. The co-housing movement was one of the results of the 1968 revolution, and one of the positive, more long-lasting results. And my wife and I were one of the first to pioneer this idea in Copenhagen, in Denmark. And the idea of the co-housing was that rather than living in an isolated apartment in the city or in a nuclear family in the suburbs with a mother, dad, and 2 children,
and your own
isolated
washing machine and everything yours.
A number of young couples like ourselves were looking for a third model, which was based on the idea of more in community and sharing and having more of a social, better social kind of life. And so this was the motivation, I think, for the co-housing movement, which then grew and has grown all over the world now. And in Denmark, it started there, and now today there are many senior co-housing projects. Well, what happened then was after about 20 years, by about 1990, we'd lived in this co-housing for 20 years, and it was very good. It was good for children in particular. Then we began to get more conscious about the environmental movement in the 80s, and more people were, questioning what do we do to have a more sustainable future. And back in 1987, my wife and I and a few other Danish friends, we formed what we called Gaia Trust, which is a charitable foundation based in Denmark with the idea of supporting sustainability projects, spiritual projects, to bring us to a more sustainable spiritual future. We didn't have any money at the time, but we had an idea, and I had some software which I had developed for the currency markets, because an economist, my background was in finance. And so I gave this to Gaia Trust with the idea that they could develop a business, and they did that. And that began to create income. And so by 1991, we had a fair amount of income coming in from this project. And so we invited a number of people from different parts of the world who were sort of intellectuals and interested in social movements and Ecovillage people to a small meeting in Denmark to brainstorm around how we could best use our limited funds. And we came to the conclusion that basically we know what the problems are already. And we know what the solutions are. We have to simply implement them, and that is to live more sustainably on the planet. And we don't need more conferences, we don't need to have more white papers. What we have to do is have action. And so that was why we put our focus on the people who are actually doing this already on the ground, the Ecovillage movement, the people who are actually, leading the way through their actual behavior and their actions. And so we decided that the thing to do was to support this movement and make it into a network, make it into an international group that could support each other. And so this led to the formation of GEN.
And GEN is now very successful.
GEN has grown since then, slowly but surely. What's happened since then is that the movement has gradually expanded. And a few years after the founding of GEN, the second major project that we supported in Gaia Trust was called Gaia Education. And this is the idea, another sort of positive-looking initiative that would supplement the Ecovillage movement by forming an educational program which could be taught at the Ecovillages or anywhere else for that matter. So we developed a curriculum based on the 4 dimensions of living, which was the social, the ecological, the economic, and the spiritual, or what we sometimes call the worldview, which is more neutral. But it's really about spirituality and culture.
We are very proud in Damanhur to be able to teach
Yes.
This,
yes, you've taught it here.
Yes,
What we call the
Ecovillages
Design Education, the
yes,
EDE.
The EDE.
And since then, we've also developed online programs teaching similar and by now greatly improved and expanded programs based on these 4 dimensions. And we're teaching them today in English and Portuguese, and we're working on additional languages coming along too.
Do you find that formal education institutions are now more open than in the past to include these themes into their curricula? Because really this is about our survival and the real issues of our time.
Unfortunately, I think that the educational institutions are some of the most conservative institutions in society and very, very slow to change. And with the current economic system, the educational system right down to the primary school is pretty much based on developing workers for the corporate society. Our society is totally dominated by corporate thinking, and our politicians are very much, in the United States, very much in the pockets of the wealthy who have their own agenda. And this is why we've seen such disruption over the last 30, 40 years, that we've seen more and more inequality. We've seen the destruction of the environment and a great dissatisfaction among the people. They don't know what to do. They don't even know, what the problem is. And a lot of them react by putting the blame on immigrants rather than understanding that it's the actual economic structure which is the basic problem.
So what could be the solution that communities bring to the world in this crisis?
I think the most important thing is to show by example how we can live more sustainably and also to have a more satisfactory social life. And more young people are beginning to realize this. I know in Denmark, just the last 2 years, there's been a tremendous upsurge in interest in the idea of living in community. And I think it's part of the reaction to this dissatisfaction we've had with the economic system over the last 30, 40 years. And people are looking for a different way of living. There's a tremendous amount of stress in all our societies these days. Everybody has to work harder, and it's this pressure which is coming. Well, it's coming really from the economic system. As I mentioned, the neoliberal system, it focuses capital, it centralizes capital, and it centralizes political power, and it leaves most people feeling totally without any influence on their lives. And so this is one way of taking back some control over their own lives, is to start living in a local community and focusing on that. And so I think this is a very positive thing. It's the first time in many years I've seen such a big interest in the idea of building more eco-villages and more co-housing. I think in Denmark we have about 30 new projects underway, and that's a relatively small country. So you were asking what has been happening since, and this is one thing that's very recent. Another thing I think which is very interesting for me is, if I look back from a personal point of view over the last, say, 30 years or so, back to the 1970s, what started as in the co-housing movement, I look at now as sort of the first wave out of maybe 3 or 4 waves, where the first wave was this idea of the social dimension of the Gaia education. When we got to the 90s, then we started to think more about the environment. And that was when the ecological dimension became more of our consciousness. And that resulted in this Ecovillage movement, which also started in Denmark. And I think that was the second wave, the Ecovillage movement. And now I think we're on the cusp of a third wave, which is just beginning now. And that is taking the whole concept of both the social and ecological dimensions and expanding into the economic dimension in regional development. This is, I see, as the next phase, where we're taking the whole concept, moving it one step higher, and starting to talk about how do we integrate these ideas into a larger area, a region, maybe anything from 10,000 to 30,000 people in a region who begin to work together to take back control of their own economy, away from the multinational corporations and the centralization of finance and power in the nation state. And so I see this as a strategy, actually, to combat the economic system. Because if we can get more and more authority and autonomy in the regions, it will gradually take power away from the center. One thing we found in Denmark, what I found was that one thing they have in common is a love of place, the place which is their region. They want that to be a better place to live. And this is where you can unite the people across different philosophical, ideological boundaries. What I hope will happen in this third wave is that we will see regions take more and more control over their own economies, beginning to ask a question mark as to why are we importing all these things from outside? Yes. And what is the actually energy that says we're importing and exporting? Begin to look at the potential there is for cooperating within the region.
Our vision of the future very often has been, in our positive projections of the future,
Yes.
which are the ones, of course, we want to hold on to because we really believe in positive thinking to transform things, is exactly that, of a world of regions, and every citizen also being aware that the earth is one. So fully having this feeling in us that we belong to our planet, to our Mother Earth, and at the same time being very active locally.
Well, another thing I find is happening now is a shift in values away from the sort of neoliberal way of thinking, which is everyone is motivated just by economics and finance, to another way of thinking that the things that are much more important to people are more cultural things, and things like trust in each other, that you trust in that other people are basically good people and they're not going to cheat you if you give them responsibility. The idea of community, of belonging to a community. And these are all the things that we're missing in this current neoliberal system, and which could be reintroduced in this regional development idea, because there you have this idea of love of place and more confidence in each other. And I'm calling this sort of a shift in our worldview towards a more value-based future.
I know you've been really also observing the development of cities. What are your thoughts for the future of them?
One of the things that is going to influence that, the development of self-driving electrical vehicles. And I don't think many people realize how big a disruption that's going to be, but in a positive sense, because right now about 95% of the time the average car is just sitting still. Self-driving cars, and you have basically very much cheaper cars, safer cars, and you have basically like a taxis that you can call up on your smartphone. You have much more efficient utilization of those vehicles, and you could probably reduce the number of vehicles by a factor of 8 or 10 even. What does that mean? It means you could free up almost a third of the area which is being used for parking spaces. I see it as a very positive future for the cities is developing urban eco-villages, if you like, where people can work together, have open areas where they can cultivate their cultural interests and also grow their own food and have this sort of an eco-village in the city. We're creating much more community, a much more satisfying form of life. And this is eventually going to, I think, lead to what I call the fourth wave, which is sometime in the future. I can't say how far. The next fourth wave is going to be a spiritual wave. That's the fourth dimension of the Gaia educational dimensions. We had the social, ecological, economic, spiritual, cultural. That is going to be the one which really starts to integrate all four of these aspects into our lives.
I find it really interesting, and also if I reflect upon the history of Damanhur, it's special to see how Damanhur started in the opposite way. We started on the fourth way because the motivation was deeply spiritual. And after that came all the others.
Yes, that's good. It's a very interesting phenomenon I've noticed across the world is that eco-villages have often started with three major motivations. One is the spiritual, as you say. One has been the social, perhaps the most common one. And some has been more ecological, based on, say, permaculture principles. And I don't think any of them started with economics.
If we had better economics, maybe communities would also, if we were more savvy in those fields.
What has happened is that no matter where they started, they gradually integrated the other aspects. That's happened here in Damanhur.
Yes.
But one of the interesting things, I think, is that the largest, most successful eco-villages are the ones that have a spiritual base. You've got Damanhur is a good example. Findhorn, Orville, Solheimer and Iceland. And there are a number of other lesser well-known. We maybe look back in another 100 years and we'll see where this movement really started. And it was started in places like Damanhur.
You've been coming to visit us a few times. You've known them for many, many years. Mm-hmm. What do you think it is our unique contribution to the world?
Well, there are many aspects of Damanhur which are very exciting, I think. But personally, one of the things I was most impressed with has been the quality of the art. The jewelry, the ceramics, the mosaics, the glasswork, the metalwork, the painting. I mean, I was amazed the first time I came. Of course, looking at the temple was also a tremendous experience. But just the quality of the work in the workshops is world class. How we can take this basic asset and make it more economically viable. We have to find some way of getting these products out into the world. I think it's really inspiring that Damanhur has nurtured so many artists.
And now we need to find a deeply spiritual marketing person that wants to help us.
It has to be a good business too.
Yes, without ever losing the spiritual aspect. Yes. The quality of our artwork is given by the fact that there is so much intention when they're made, so much meaning for us in what is created, that these objects are alive.
Yes.
And that's what we try to transmit, this idea that in everything we do, spirituality turns into action, and that changes the frequency of everything.
Yeah, good.
That's